Well, thank you all for having me today, virtually as it may be. I'm really interested to talk with you all, and I hope that the digital version works okay. I have a bit of an echo on my end, so if my talking isn't perfect, please appreciate that. So to get started, when I was asked to speak today, I was trying to think of a theme that might resonate with this audience. And what I thought would be something about kids first. I feel like this is an audience that could resonate with this topic, and I want to walk you through why I chose this today. So as a background, this is where I'm usually in Amsterdam, usually in very beautiful days, but at the moment, it looks a little bit more like this, as around the globe, we are really facing the pandemic and what it means to us. And I want to mention this point because I think when creating this talk, I need to keep in mind the pandemic is something we're all managing and dealing with, children too. And so there will be points today in my talk that I take a moment and call out the pandemic because it does affect how we work, live, and play, and it affects our children as well. So what do I mean by kids and what am I talking about? Well, when it comes to kids, what we know is they are adopting media at younger and younger ages. And in fact, what we see is that kids today are beginning to use a mobile phone by the age of 7. In fact, in Poland, we see that the age of children who use a smartphone is as young as 6 years old, and that by the time they're about 7, 73% of kids are using the internet from their smartphone. That's a lot of use. That's a lot of time or, let's say, experience with digital technology. So what does this mean? Why do we care about this? Well, the thing is they're doing more and more, and they're accessing it in more and more ways, and they're experiencing more enriching experiences than ever before, but we don't fully understand them yet. At the same time, we have this pandemic where parents are homeschooling their kids in certain parts of the world, where children are attending virtual school in some parts of the world, where children are being confronted with and using technology more than ever before. And so I think when we talk about these things, when we talk about the increasing access to technology, the younger ages of technology, the fact that we're in a pandemic, which is bringing technology even closer to us, we have to think about what do we do? How do we understand this space? How do we make a difference? So with that in mind, I suggest a kids first approach. And that involves understanding how do we understand media effects? What does that mean? The concepts we use and the solutions we employ. So to get started, let's talk about effects. What do we mean by effects? I think effects is a very loaded concept, but I imagine those of you in the audience have your own idea about how media affect children. Well, I would argue that the way we think about media effects, we often take a one-size-fits-all approach. But in fact, one size certainly does not fit all. And if there's one thing you take away from today, it would be the focus on individual differences. Now, what do I mean by that? Sorry, I've lost my ability to click. Hold on, guys. So when we're talking about individual differences, we're talking about 3 things. We're talking about development. So how old is the child, for example, or what is their emotional development, or what is their social development? We're talking about personality. So we're talking about who they are. Who are these young people? And we're also talking about their broader social context. So what does their home environment look like? What does their school environment look like? These all matter quite significantly. So I want to give you an example of how this matters, and I want to be sensitive to time today, so I'm going to keep this this part of the discussion reasonably short. But when we talk about effects, we typically talk about the idea that media affects children, and we'll talk about how it might affect their cognition or maybe their social emotional development. But what does that really mean? Well, typically when I talk with scholars or with teachers or with parents or with caregivers or with pediatricians, I hear comments about Media maybe has sexualized my young child or given them information about sex too early. Or media causes violence, media causes aggressive behavior. Or I hear media leads to bullying, right? And these are things that I imagine the people in the audience have heard. Yes, I often worry about sex and media content, violent media, bullying online. And these are very fair and very reasonable concerns. But I worry about them. And the reason I worry about them is for three reasons in particular. One, let me try to walk you through my slides here. One, this is really a cautionary tale. So what I mean by that is that when we hear these effects, when we hear this, media leads to aggression, media causes sexualized ideas, media leads to cyberbullying, it scares us quite a bit, right? But at the same time, what's actually happening is usually this data is based off of one study, right? It's our rose here. It's our one red tulip. It's based off of one study and trying to apply it to everyone. And what I usually argue is that this is really what we call a chocolate headline. And by chocolate headline, I mean it's something very sweet and very accessible that the media can use to tell a story. Media affects young kids. Media causes horror. Media causes aggression. Media causes sex. These are very easy headlines. They're very accessible. They're very easy to sell. But they're based off of one study and they're designed to scare us. And they're not telling the full truth. Because in fact, what we know is that with any of these things, it's far more complicated. For example, violent media does not affect all children. Instead, it tends to affect children who grow up in households with a lot of conflict as well. It's also more likely to affect boys, and it's also more likely to affect kids with a very aggressive or very angry temperament, right? It's not that simple. It's not that it affects all kids in all situations. It's certain children in certain situations, and that's a big difference. And the reason it's a big difference is because just as media can have these negative effects for some kids in some situations, we also have examples where it can have positive effects. We know that young children can actually practice their communication skills, and in fact, they very much enjoy practicing them with robots these days. We know that children enjoy interacting and physically engaging with games, which can actually promote physical activity. And we know that there's a good deal of actual educational content in the form of apps, for example, that can be particularly effective for children who maybe are very curious for learning, maybe are particularly introverted in temperament, or grow up in a household that really supports the use of media as a potential tool for learning. So at the end of the day, when it comes to media effects, the chocolate headlines we see that says media is all bad are generally not true. The truth is complicated, nuanced, and messy. But media has both good and bad effects. And so what I always say is if we're trying to understand them, a kids first approach means not thinking of all kids, but really valuing their beautiful individual differences that make them who they are. So that's one tip I would say when starting to try to understand the space. Don't look so high, but really dive in a bit more. Second point I would say is, and I've said this in other talks I've given as well, and you might have heard me emphasize this point, we have to be really careful with the concepts we use. I find myself using the phrase screen time very often, and I'm sure you do as well. It's a phrase that's become part of our popular rhetoric. It's a way we talk about how young kids use media. I've done it, we all do it. But I often say it's a broken compass, and it's something I'm trying to break my habit of using, and I'm encouraging the others to do the same. Why? Why do I think this idea of screen time is problematic? Well, a couple of reasons. One, we're really bad at measuring screen time. I'm not even sure how to measure screen time in the age of the pandemic where I'm giving keynote addresses from my living room. Is this screen time? What does it look like? At the same point, when we measure screen time, we're implicitly saying the more you do this, the worse or better something is. We're assuming this sort of what we call a linear relationship. But it's not linear. Actually, what they tend to find is something called the digital Goldilocks hypothesis, based on the children's fable. Too little can have its own problems, right? Too little media can have its own negative effects, and too much can be problematic. But there is some sort of sweet spot that can be healthy and beneficial to some kids in some situations, depending upon the content. So this idea that all we look at is screen use really does not tell the true story and doesn't even match how we think. And we know this to be true because everyone in this audience would be able to say that having a conversation on FaceTime with one's grandparents or engaging in an app, an educational app, is far different than saying, let me fix how I look and edit my image on Instagram or being bullied on social media. These are very different ideas, so lumping them into the phrase screen time does not do us service at all. And as I mentioned, we are in this pandemic. Again, I want to call us that point. And this pandemic truly changes the amount of time we are all spending on media because we are using it more than ever before to connect with each other, particularly in times of quarantine. And we're seeing that the second wave is beginning in many different places, including right here where I am. And we are beginning home quarantine again. And we know that during these moments where we cannot connect with each other, we will use digital media to do so. And to suddenly lump this into screen time and debate, I think mixes up the key values here. And with that in mind, I would say as a second takeaway point, when it comes to kids first, it means moving beyond screen time to thinking about kids' needs instead, right? Take that individual difference idea, think of that child, and then think about the needs they have. What is the amount of content? And maybe it's not just amount, but it's going to be most likely and should be, as I would argue, also the content, also the place and space they're consuming it in. It may be that in some days, 3 hours of high quality content is better than the alternative. It's dependent upon what they're using it for. If they're doing virtual learning at home, that's going to require a significantly greater amount of time than if they're playing an entertaining game. So we have to really take this in a broader perspective and value quality over quantity and think of that individual difference from point one more. We also have to think of solutions. Now, solutions, I think, is a laden, very heavy concept. What do we mean by solution? What does it look like? What are we trying to solve? I could list this and probably spend an hour just talking about solutions. And in fact, in many keynote addresses, that's actually what I've done. But I understand that today, many of the audience members are teachers, which first, I want to just take a moment and say thank you. Your profession is one of the most important we have in the world. And we could not do anything we do without you. So if nobody else has said this today, if you are a teacher watching this today, please know that I'm thanking you. It makes you are changing our world every single day by what you do. And with that in mind, I feel somewhat unsure if I should ask you to do more, right? What solutions should we come up with? But I assume if you're listening today, that you are interested in thinking about this space. And you are interested to understand that the media effects we talk about are more nuanced. That screen time as a concept is probably outdated and we need to kind of get into the messy dirt more. But also are interested to know what you can do. With that in mind, I would argue 3 potential things. 1, I call Boost, balancing online and offline screen time. This is named after a grant proposal that I'm part of. 2, supporting digital literacy. And 3, understanding and focusing on children's rights. And let me discuss each of these a bit more. So normally when I talk about Boost, balancing online and offline screen time, what I mean is how can you help contribute to the space where kids have activities in both spaces, right? I don't think everything should be online. What we know from the world around us is that there's a very healthy opportunity to shut our minds down and to disconnect. We've learned this from the traditions in the East for years that we need a moment to stop and think in order to be creative, to quiet our minds. And so usually in these sorts of talks, I encourage finding ways to help young kids have mindfulness in their daily life. So getting away from the digital and into the moment where they're engaging in more mindful, quiet activities. And I know you're doing many of this already, and I see it as so valuable. But I also want to recognize that during a pandemic, mindfulness may be harder to achieve, particularly when we're requiring more online spaces. And if that's the case in your own community, if you're struggling with what to do in this interesting 2020 world, I might suggest a couple other things. If you're using online content, find content that provides lessons and courses for young kids to sort of inspire them, and decide that based on your own pedagogy as a scholar, as a teacher. For kids who are a bit older, if you're teaching kids maybe 9, 10, 11 years of age, help them learn how to assess accurate messages. There's a lot of fiction out there. Misinformation is scary. Can you help them with that? Think about games that allow them to be moving and physically fun and engaging too. Encourage that space that maybe bridge online and offline. Remember that their peers are so valuable. And if they're unable to be together because of social distancing, offering opportunities where they can connect over digital media can be incredibly valuable. This is such an important part of their development, as you know, as teachers. And always be mindful of their safety and privacy, right? They're young people, but they still deserve the same rights we have as adults. They really deserve the safety and privacy that we all fight so hard for. So how can you make sure you're protecting that in whatever aspects you're engaging with? And I want to expand on this more to my second point. So one, try to balance online and offline as you can. And when the balance shifts to online more, try to find activities that really enrich them as much as possible. And you can always reach out to me if you'd like to get some inspiration on what those might be. Also consider digital literacy. Is this something your school district, if your teacher would allow? If you're a parent, is there a way you can have conversations about this? If you're a policymaker, can you begin to advance the conversation about digital literacy? This is a confusing term that many people struggle to understand. It's not just safety online. It's not just making sure that a young child is safe and secure in their digital space. It's also making sure they know how to get help. We call it problem solving on the end of this slide here. They know how to get help when they're struggling, right? So there's the negative parts. If they're struggling, we can help them and we make sure they know how to be safe and they know what safe behaviors is. But there's this other side of the slide that we often forget about. We think about the problem solving. We think about the safety, the privacy. That's what comes to mind when we think of digital literacy, how to make sure young kids are safe in their digital space. But can we also help them learn about its benefits? Can we help them learn how to create content online? It's a beautiful skill. Can we help them learn how to do it? Kids are so good at picking these skills up. Can we help them practice communication and collaboration? During the pandemic, it's probably the quickest thing we can do is begin to help them understand how they can communicate and collaborate with their peers, even in very simple ways, right? And do they know how, when they get information, how they can assess its quality? This is that part I raised before about misinformation. Can they begin to fact check? Can we teach them how to take everything they receive in a digital space with a so-called grain of salt, a little bit of step back and think? What can you do in your own sphere, whether it's home or school or policy, to begin advancing digital literacy? This is probably the skill, literally the skill we need for resilience to the pandemic and to the technological transformations of our time. How do we help them do this? And lastly, let's always do this with a mindfulness towards children's global digital rights. Children, how we often think about protecting them. We think of them as something that we should protect and make sure they're safe, as their space is safe online. But we need to do more than just protect them in that space. They have the rights to provision and participation too. This is based on the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. They have the right to engage actively in the digital spaces we create and to have spaces that actually are engaging for them. So let's not only think of the negative freedom in our world of protection, but let's consider the positive freedoms too. And how can you begin advancing those conversations? Digital literacy gives them the skills to do so, but we also need creators and policymakers to begin to advance and push the buttons to say, let's make sure there are spaces for these kids, which is much of which I think this conference is doing, raising that conversation and to say, and reminding all of us that young kids deserve this too. What role can you play in advancing that? Now, what I would say then is that means putting kids first, right? Thinking about them from the very beginning, whether it's identifying how you boost them, what their digital literacy looks like, or how we put their rights there too. Kids first means thinking of kids at the very center of these conversations. And these conversations need to happen at the public policy level. They need to happen at the level of creating technology. They need to happen in the schools, which are such a powerful space for young people, and of course in their homes as well. If we can do that, if we can really put kids first and think about it from the way we value their individual differences, if we can think about it from how we consider the context of their effects, if we can think about it from the solutions we offer to them, and if we can do so with an understanding that screen time is probably not the indicator, and we need to really be understanding more about their screen and media experiences. If we can do these things and even ensure that these experiences are positive and move away from only negative freedoms to also positive, we have the opportunity to inspire, engage, protect, and delight our next generation. And I think that's just an awesome space to be in. And I thank you all for being here today, for listening in this very unique time that we're in, and for contributing to the lives of young children. What you do is so very meaningful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for a very interesting speech. We have one question to you concerning your presentation from the audience. The question is, which children are resistant to negative influence of media? Does it depend on age or maybe gender? Thank you very much.
That's a great question. Depend on either age or gender, actually. What we find is that it really depends much more on their family dynamics. And it depends on the content. There is no one sort of media content that young children are resistant to. What is appealing to one child is very unappealing to another. So it involves learning about the child and learning about their characteristics before we can identify that. But what we do know is that a supportive household, supportive family, when they grow up in homes that's known as autonomy supportive. In other words, they grow up in families where parents encourage them to be autonomous individuals and give them support, but they hold back when they need to, right? They provide the right provisions to stop them when it's going too far. Right? So it's a safe space to explore without danger. When they grow up in that space, they tend to be able to field many of life's challenges a bit more easily because they feel the confidence to understand it, but the safety is to know when to stop.
The last question is, can you, Jessica, suggest any educational program for kids?
Oh, yes, there's many. I don't think there's actually one. I would say there's many different apps online. There's beautiful ratings tools. One of my favorites, there's programs by, for example, Toca Boca apps have great apps for younger kids. But for example, there's also beautiful rating spaces like Common Sense Media, which lets you begin to understand based on the age of your child, what sort of content they need. So a question like that can be hard to answer because my follow-up question would be to this audience member, can you tell me the age of your child? Can you tell me his or the gender of your child? Can you tell me what they like in school? There's actually so many beautiful types of content out there. The bigger tip would be check out what your child watches, uses, plays, and see how it aligns with your own family values. And if it feels good to you and you can have conversations that extend it in powerful ways, or even that criticize it when you disagree with it, this too is a learning opportunity. So it's never that easy for me to say one area. I often suggest that parents identify what type of content their kids like and then look at the range of content that goes along with it. I'm happy to provide lists of apps and games and things, but at the end of the day, it really is so much about the individual difference of your child. But I do believe that there's a lot of beautiful rating tools, and the Safer Internet Forum actually has an incredible wealth of information about positive digital tech for kids. And they've done an incredible job of sorting out by lots of unique characteristics of the child recommendations. So if you haven't checked out SIF's resources yet, I think that's a beautiful space to start.
Okay, and as we can notice, your speech is very, very popular and very interesting for our participants because I have another question concerning the results of your research. It's very long, so maybe first I will read it in Polish and then I will try to translate it. Okay, so maybe in Polish. Jakie są zagrożenia dla
So what are the threats for the children and for the children's health related to balancing of the offline and online time? And what do you understand by boost? To be more specific, could you elaborate on that? So what is this balancing of an offline and online time? For instance, in terms of hours spent online.
So this question is a beautiful question. It's about boost. And what do I mean by boost? So there is no perfect balance between online and offline. It also depends, for example, on the temperament of your child. The weather outside that day. If it's raining, they're probably using TV a bit more. But what we do know is that in general, we see that it's really important for kids to be physically moving, right? Because we're looking for healthy body weight. So we're not looking for something where they're sedentary all day long. So making sure they get fresh air if it's safe in a safe area for them, moving, and that's an offline activity. Offline activities may also be coloring or drawing or collecting rocks or playing in a backyard if that's available, or even taking what they've seen in an online space and then creating an offline component. So you'll see what we call media traces, where what kids are inspired by online will be part of their offline play, where suddenly they become Superman or Spider-Woman or any of these things. All of that time where they're just given a chance to be creative, to quiet their mind and just enjoy the world around them is incredibly valuable. How much do they need? It's really dependent upon certain temperaments. For some parents will say, the most she can watch TV or play a game is this, and that's all it is. And then she acts up, right? Trust parenting. You know your children better than anybody else. So there is no perfect answer, but I always say, we know that children need fresh air. They need physical activity. They need creative spaces to just think and experience and process the world around them. And then they can also benefit from the online spaces when it allows them to be active in the content that they create, be engaged in that space, and be socialized with the world around them, right? So be socializing in some way. We often look at for a learning goal in content. Is there some goal of the app or the book or the TV show or the movie? Can you identify a learning goal? And then when you look at it, do you see an opportunity for your child to be active, for them to be engaged, for the efforts to be very meaningful and connected to the lesson, and for them to connect socially in some way? Maybe it's even just a fake socialization or parasocial with the character. But if you see those four things, can they be active? Can they be engaged? Can it connect in a very logical way? Is it a meaningful message? So are what they're doing connected to the learning goal? And does it engage in some way them socially? If you see those four things tied to a learning goal, right? So it's part of a bigger goal, whether it's math or reading or social studies, right? If you see that connection, then you have a good sense that that's some pretty good content online. And if you can match that with beautiful offline experiences, you are really boosting your child's development in a beautiful way.
Thank you very much, Jessica. As you said, it's very difficult, but it is our task, our goal as a teacher and parents to make kids safe online and offline. Once again, thank you very much for your speech. I hope you will stay with us, listening our next speakers. Once again, thanks.